In 1923, the Greymarch Institute for Christian Education in Little Rock, Arkansas, reported the deaths of 17 children in what officials termed a tragic dormitory fire of unknown origin. The official report, filed with the Arkansas State Board of Education on November 15, 1923, described the incident with clinical detachment. 17 bodies recovered from the East Wing dormitory, all between the ages of 8 and 14, all found in their beds despite the fire alarm system that had been installed just months earlier. What the report failed to mention were the locked doors, the boarded windows, and the strange burns that covered the children's bodies in patterns that defied explanation. What it couldn't account for were the testimonies of the 3 survivors who spoke of screams that began hours before any flames appeared, or the fact that the Greymarch family's private records discovered decades later contained detailed documentation of what they called corrective thermal therapy administered to children deemed spiritually contaminated. The institution's reputation, the Greymarch Institute for Christian Education, stood as a monument to moral rectitude in the heart of Little Rock, Arkansas, its red brick facade and soaring bell tower commanding respect from all who passed along Markham Street. Founded in 1898 by Reverend Augustus Greymarch, the institution had earned a reputation as one of the finest boarding schools in the American South, attracting the children of prominent families from across Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. Augustus Greymarch was a man of imposing stature and unwavering conviction. Born in 1852 to a family of Methodist ministers, he had distinguished himself as a scholar at Vanderbilt University before embarking on a career that would see him become one of the most influential religious educators of his generation. His philosophy, outlined in his 1895 treatise, The Purification of Youth Through Christian Discipline, emphasized the importance of removing children from the corrupting influences of modern society and subjecting them to rigorous spiritual and academic training. The Institute's prospectus, distributed to wealthy families throughout the region, promised a comprehensive education that would prepare young minds for leadership in an increasingly complex world. Students would receive instruction in classical languages, mathematics, natural sciences, and Christian theology, all within an environment that emphasized moral character and spiritual development. The school's motto, Ignis Purificat, fire purifies, was emblazoned on every piece of correspondence and carved into the stone archway above the main entrance. By 1900, the Greymarch Institute housed over 200 students, ranging in age from 8 to 18. The faculty consisted of carefully selected educators, many of whom had studied at prestigious Eastern universities, before being recruited to join Augustus Greymarch's vision of Christian education. The curriculum was demanding, with students rising at 5 o'clock each morning for prayer and devotional exercises, followed by 8 hours of academic instruction and 2 hours of manual labor designed to build character and discipline. The physical plant of the institution was impressive by any standard. The main academic building, constructed of locally quarried limestone, contained 24 classrooms, a library housing over 10,000 volumes, and a chapel capable of seating 500 worshippers. The dormitory facilities were equally substantial, with separate wings for male and female students, each containing individual sleeping quarters, common areas for study and recreation, and apartments for the housemasters who supervised residential life. Parents who entrusted their children to the Greymarch Institute came from the highest echelons of Southern society. Among the student body were the sons and daughters of plantation owners, merchants, politicians, and clergy. The Pemberton family of Little Rock sent 3 of their children to the Institute, as did the Washingtons of Pine Bluff and the Clarks of Hot Springs. These families paid substantial tuition fees, often in excess of $300 per year, a sum that represented a significant investment in their children's futures. The Institute's reputation for academic excellence was well-deserved. Graduates consistently gained admission to prestigious universities, including Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and the University of Virginia. Many went on to distinguish themselves in law, medicine, politics, and business. The school's debate team won state championships in 1903, 1905, and 1907, while its academic decathlon team claimed regional honors on multiple occasions. Augustus Greymarch's own family was intimately involved in the operation of the institution. His wife, Constance, served as the school's matron, overseeing the female dormitories and supervising the domestic staff. Their son, Theodore, joined the faculty in 1905 after completing his studies at Princeton Theological Seminary, while their daughter, Evangeline, taught music and supervised the school's renowned choir. The Greymarch family residence, a grand Victorian mansion adjacent to the main campus, served as both a symbol of the institution's prosperity and a center for the social activities that bound the school community together. The institute's influence extended far beyond its academic programs. Augustus Greymarch was a frequent speaker at educational conferences throughout the South, and his writings on Christian pedagogy were widely read and respected. He served on the boards of several charitable organizations and was a founding member of the Arkansas Association of Private Schools. His opinions on matters of education, morality, and social policy were regularly sought by newspapers and magazines, and he was regarded as one of the most authoritative voices on the proper upbringing of young people. The daily routine at the Greymarch Institute was structured with military precision. Students rose at 5 o'clock for morning prayers, followed by personal hygiene and dormitory inspection. Breakfast was served at 6:30, with all students required to maintain perfect silence during the meal. Academic classes began at 8 o'clock and continued until 4 in the afternoon, with a brief break for lunch. The evening hours were devoted to study, with students required to remain in their dormitories under the supervision of housemasters and prefects. Discipline at the institution was strict, but according to official accounts, fair and consistent. Students who violated rules faced a system of graduated punishments, ranging from loss of privileges to confinement in individual study rooms. More serious infractions could result in suspension or expulsion, though such extreme measures were rarely necessary given the high quality of students attracted to the institution. The institute's success was reflected in its continued growth and expansion. By 1910, enrollment had increased to over 300 students, necessitating the construction of additional dormitory facilities and a new dining hall. The school's endowment, built through generous donations from alumni and supporters, exceeded $500,000 by 1915, ensuring the institution's financial stability and ability to maintain its high standards. Religious life at the Greymarch Institute was central to the educational mission. Students attended chapel services twice daily, participated in weekly Bible study groups, and were required to memorize substantial portions of Scripture. The school's choir, under the direction of Evangeline Greymarch, performed at churches throughout Arkansas and was invited to sing at the 1912 Southern Baptist Convention in Jacksonville, Florida. Many graduates went on to careers in the ministry, carrying the institute's influence into pulpits across the South. The institution's relationship with the broader Little Rock community was generally positive. Local businesses benefited from the school's presence, providing goods and services to the institution and employment opportunities for area residents. The school's annual Spring Festival, featuring student performances and displays of academic work, drew thousands of visitors to the campus and was regarded as one of the city's premier social events. As the 1920s approached, the Greymarch Institute appeared to be at the height of its influence and prosperity. Enrollment remained strong, despite increasing competition from public schools and other private institutions. The faculty was stable and experienced, with many teachers having served for over a decade. The physical plant was well maintained and modern, with recent improvements including electric lighting throughout the campus and a new heating system for the dormitories. Augustus Greymarch, now in his 70s, remained actively involved in the day-to-day operations of the institution, though he had begun to delegate more responsibilities to his son, Theodore, and other senior faculty members. His health was generally good, and he continued to travel extensively, speaking at educational conferences and visiting with prospective students and their families. The future of the institution seemed secure, with a clear succession plan in place, and a strong foundation of support from alumni and the broader community. The reputation of the Greymarch Institute for Christian Education in 1923 was that of an institution beyond reproach, a beacon of moral and academic excellence in an increasingly turbulent world. Parents who sent their children to the school did so with complete confidence that they would receive the finest education available, grounded in Christian principles and designed to prepare them for lives of service and leadership. The tragic events of November 1923 would shatter this reputation forever, revealing that beneath the veneer of respectability lay secrets that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Ignored signs. The first troubling report came in the spring of 1921, when Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton of Little Rock wrote to the Arkansas State Board of Education expressing concern about her son's condition after his return from the Greymarch Institute. 12-year-old William Pemberton, who had been a robust and cheerful child before his enrollment, had become withdrawn and fearful, exhibiting what his mother described as an unnatural terror of enclosed spaces and an obsessive fear of fire. The boy would wake screaming from nightmares, speaking of the hot room and the burning prayers, but would fall silent whenever pressed for details about his experiences at the school. Mrs. Pemberton's letter, discovered in the State Archives in 1987, described her son's physical condition with clinical precision. William had returned home 20 pounds underweight, with what appeared to be healed burn marks on his arms and back. When questioned about these injuries, the boy claimed they resulted from correction sessions administered by Theodore Greymarch, but would provide no further explanation. Mrs. Pemberton's request for an investigation was forwarded to the Department of Private School Oversight, where it was filed without action and eventually forgotten. Similar reports began to accumulate throughout 1921 and 1922, though most were dismissed as the complaints of overprotective parents or the fantasies of imaginative children. The Henderson family of Pine Bluff withdrew their daughter Margaret after she began exhibiting what they termed nervous disorders following her second year at the institute. Margaret Henderson, aged 14, had developed severe burns on her hands that she claimed resulted from prayer discipline, administered in the basement of the main building. The family's physician, Dr. Samuel Crawford, documented the injuries in his medical records, noting that the burns were consistent with prolonged exposure to heated metal objects. Dr. Crawford's report, submitted to the Arkansas Medical Association in October 1922, described Margaret Henderson's condition as consistent with systematic physical abuse of an unusual and disturbing nature. The burns on her hands formed distinct patterns that suggested the use of heated branding instruments, while psychological examination revealed symptoms consistent with severe trauma. Dr. Crawford's recommendation for a formal investigation was referred to the State Attorney General's office, where it was determined that insufficient evidence existed to warrant legal action. The most detailed early account came from James Franklin, a former groundskeeper at the Greymarch Institute, who was dismissed from his position in September 1922 after, according to his personnel file, expressing concerns about institutional practices that exceeded his authority and responsibilities. Franklin's testimony, recorded in a sworn affidavit submitted to the Pulaski County Sheriff's Department, described a pattern of systematic abuse that he had observed during his 3 years of employment at the school. According to Franklin's account, certain students would be selected for what Theodore Greymarch called intensive spiritual correction and would be taken to a specially constructed room in the basement of the main building. Franklin had observed these sessions while performing maintenance work in the building's lower levels and described seeing children subjected to procedures that he found deeply disturbing. The room, which Franklin estimated to be approximately 12 feet square, contained what he described as metal furniture that could be heated through a system of pipes connected to the building's furnace. Franklin's affidavit described his observations in careful detail. Children selected for correction would be brought to the basement room, typically during the late evening hours when most students were asleep. The sessions, which Franklin observed from a ventilation shaft that provided access to the room's heating system, involved the application of heated metal objects to various parts of the children's bodies, accompanied by what Theodore Greymarch called purification prayers. The children were required to remain silent during these procedures, and Franklin reported that those who cried out or attempted to resist were subjected to additional punishment. The groundskeeper's account was corroborated by several other staff members who had observed similar activities, but had been reluctant to report them due to fear of losing their employment. Mary Sullivan, a kitchen worker who had been employed at the Institute since 1919, provided a statement to Franklin's attorney describing her observations of children who appeared to have been injured during correction sessions. Sullivan reported that she had frequently been required to prepare special meals for students who were unable to eat normal food due to injuries to their mouths and throats. Sullivan's statement, notarized on November 3, 1922, described the appearance of children who had undergone correction as like they had been burned from the inside out. She reported that these students would often be unable to speak for days following their sessions and would exhibit extreme fear when approached by faculty members. Sullivan's attempts to provide comfort to these children had been discouraged by her supervisors, who warned her that excessive concern for student welfare could result in her dismissal. The pattern of abuse described by Franklin and Sullivan was confirmed by additional witnesses who came forward following the groundskeeper's dismissal. Helen Brooks, a former laundry worker, reported that she had frequently been required to dispose of clothing that had been damaged by what appeared to be heat and chemical burns. Brooks described finding undergarments that had been melted to students' skin, requiring careful removal and disposal to avoid detection by inspectors or visiting parents. Despite the accumulation of witness testimony and documented evidence, local authorities proved reluctant to investigate the allegations against the Greymarch Institute. Sheriff Robert Anderson of Pulaski County, whose own nephew attended the school, dismissed the reports as malicious gossip spread by disgruntled employees seeking to damage the reputation of a respected institution. Anderson's investigation, such as it was, consisted of a brief interview with Augustus Greymarch and a cursory inspection of the school's public areas. The reluctance of authorities to pursue the allegations was influenced by the Institute's prominent position in Little Rock society and the political connections of the Greymarch family. Augustus Greymarch served on the board of directors of the First National Bank of Little Rock and was a close associate of Governor Thomas McRae. The school's board of trustees included some of the most influential figures in Arkansas politics and business, making any investigation politically sensitive and potentially career-damaging for ambitious prosecutors. The situation was further complicated by the fact that many of the children subjected to abuse were from families who had significant financial and social investments in the Institute's reputation. Parents who had paid substantial tuition fees and had boasted of their children's attendance at the prestigious school were reluctant to acknowledge that their offspring might have been systematically abused. The social stigma associated with such admissions, combined with the lack of viable alternatives for their children's education, created a conspiracy of silence that protected the institution from scrutiny. By the summer of 1923, however, the situation at the Greymarch Institute had reached a crisis point. The number of students exhibiting signs of physical and psychological trauma had increased dramatically, and several families had quietly withdrawn their children without providing explanations. The school's enrollment, which had peaked at over 300 students, had declined to fewer than 200, creating financial pressures that threatened the institution's stability. The decline in enrollment was accompanied by an increase in the severity of the abuse, as Theodore Greymarch apparently sought to maintain discipline through increasingly extreme measures. According to later testimony from survivors, the correction sessions became more frequent and more brutal during the months leading up to the November 1923 fire. Students who had previously been subjected to relatively minor punishments found themselves selected for intensive treatment, while those who had already undergone correction were subjected to additional sessions that left them permanently traumatized. The escalation of abuse was documented in a series of letters written by students to their families, most of which were intercepted by school officials before they could be mailed. These letters, discovered in Theodore Greymarch's private files following his death in 1954, provided detailed accounts of the systematic torture that had become routine at the institute. The letters described not only the physical abuse, but also the psychological manipulation used to ensure student compliance and silence. One particularly disturbing letter, written by 13-year-old Dorothy Hughes to her parents in Memphis, described the selection process used to identify students for correction. According to Hughes' account, children were chosen based on perceived spiritual deficiencies, academic failures, or violations of the school's behavioral codes. The selection process was arbitrary and unpredictable, creating an atmosphere of constant fear among the student body. The ignored signs of systematic abuse at the Greymarch Institute were numerous and clear to anyone willing to look beyond the institution's carefully maintained facade. The reluctance of authorities to investigate the allegations, the silence of parents who feared for their social standing, and the intimidation of potential witnesses created an environment in which the abuse could and escalate without fear of consequences. The tragic events of November 1923 would finally force a reckoning with the truth that had been so carefully concealed. Horror uncovered. The investigation that followed the November 15, 1923, fire began as a routine inquiry into the cause of the blaze that had claimed 17 young lives. Fire Marshal Charles Baker arrived at the Greymarch Institute at dawn on November 16th, expecting to find the typical aftermath of a tragic but explainable accident. What he discovered instead was evidence of a systematic cover-up that extended far beyond the events of that single horrific night. Baker's initial examination of the fire scene revealed several disturbing anomalies. The dormitory doors, which should have been unlocked to allow for emergency evacuation, were found secured with heavy chains and padlocks. The windows in the affected wing had been boarded shut from the outside, preventing escape, even if the occupants had been able to reach them. Most puzzling of all, the fire damage was concentrated in specific areas of the building, suggesting that the blaze had been deliberately set and carefully controlled. The 17 bodies recovered from the dormitory were found in positions that defied explanation. Rather than clustering near doors or windows in desperate attempts to escape, the victims were discovered in their beds, arranged in what appeared to be deliberate poses. Post-mortem examination revealed that many of the children had died not from smoke inhalation, as would be expected in a fire, but from what the county coroner described as thermal injuries consistent with prolonged exposure to extreme heat applied to specific areas of the body. Dr. Edward Collins, the forensic pathologist called in to examine the remains, documented his findings in a report that would not be released to the public for over 60 years. According to Dr. Collins' analysis, the victims had been subjected to systematic torture before their deaths, with evidence of repeated burning applied to their extremities, torso, and internal organs. The injuries were inflicted using heated metal instruments that left distinctive patterns on the children's skin, patterns that matched implements found in the basement room that James Franklin had described in his earlier testimony. The 3 survivors of the fire provided accounts that revealed the full extent of the horror that had been concealed within the institute's walls. 8-year-old Margaret Wells, who had escaped through a basement window, described being awakened by screams from the dormitory's upper floors. According to her testimony, recorded by Sheriff Anderson 3 days after the fire, the screaming had begun hours before any flames were visible, suggesting that the children were being tortured before the building was set ablaze. Wells' account, given in the presence of her parents and a court-appointed attorney, described a night of unimaginable terror. She had been awakened around midnight by what she initially thought were the sounds of other children having nightmares, but quickly realized were screams of pain and terror. When she attempted to leave her room to investigate, she found that the dormitory doors had been locked from the outside. The screaming continued for what she estimated to be several hours, accompanied by the sound of adult voices conducting what she described as burning prayers. The second survivor, 10-year-old Ruth Palmer, had escaped through a window in the building's west wing that had been left unboarded due to what investigators later determined was an oversight. Palmer's testimony provided additional details about the events leading up to the fire. According to her account, Theodore Greymarch and several faculty members had entered the dormitory around 11 o'clock, accompanied by what she described as boxes of metal tools that had been heated in the building's furnace. Alma's description of the systematic torture that followed was documented in excruciating detail by investigators. She reported that the children were removed from their beds one by one and subjected to procedures that involved the application of heated metal objects to various parts of their bodies. The victims were required to recite specific prayers while being tortured, and those who failed to comply were subjected to additional punishment. The process continued for several hours, with the screaming growing more intense as the night progressed. The third survivor, 12-year-old Elizabeth Dixon, had hidden in a storage closet when the torture began and had witnessed the entire ordeal through a crack in the door. Her testimony, recorded in a series of interviews conducted over several weeks, provided the most complete account of the events of November 15, 1923. According to Dixon's description, the torture sessions were conducted with ritualistic precision, following procedures that had clearly been practiced and refined over time. Dixon's account revealed that the children selected for torture that night had been chosen based on their previous resistance to the correction procedures. Many of the victims had been subjected to abuse on multiple occasions and had been targeted for elimination because they were considered security risks. The fire, according to Dixon's testimony, was set only after all 17 children had been killed through systematic torture, with the flames intended to conceal the evidence of their murders. The investigation expanded when authorities discovered Theodore Greymarch's private files, hidden in a concealed room beneath the main building. The files, which contained detailed records of the abuse spanning over 5 years, provided documentary evidence of the systematic torture that had been conducted at the institute. The records included photographs of the victims, detailed descriptions of the correction procedures, and careful documentation of the psychological effects of the abuse. The files revealed that the abuse had been far more extensive than previously suspected. Over 200 students had been subjected to correction procedures between 1918 and 1923, with the intensity and frequency of the abuse increasing dramatically during the final years of the institution's operation. The records indicated that at least 47 students had died as a result of the torture, with their deaths concealed through falsified medical records and forged death certificates. Dr. Walter Green, a psychiatrist brought in to evaluate the psychological aspects of the abuse, described the files as documenting the most systematic and methodical torture of children in American history. The records revealed that Theodore Greymarch had developed an elaborate theoretical framework to justify the abuse based on his interpretation of Christian theology and contemporary theories of child psychology. The torture was presented as a form of spiritual purification designed to eliminate sin and corruption from the children's souls. The discovery of the files led to additional investigations that revealed the complicity of numerous faculty members and staff in the systematic abuse. At least 12 teachers and administrators had participated directly in the torture sessions, while dozens of others had knowledge of the abuse but had failed to report it to authorities. The scope of the conspiracy was so extensive that it became clear that the abuse could not have continued without the knowledge and consent of the entire institutional hierarchy. The financial records contained in Theodore Greymarch's files revealed another disturbing aspect of the abuse. The institute had been charging parents additional fees for the intensive spiritual correction of their children, with some families paying as much as $500 annually for what they believed were specialized educational services. The torture of children had become a profitable enterprise, with the Greymarch family accumulating significant wealth through the systematic abuse of their students. The investigation also revealed that several graduates of the institute had gone on to establish similar institutions in other states, spreading the methods of abuse developed at the Greymarch Institute throughout the South. A network of schools and reformatories operated according to the principles established by Augustus and Theodore Greymarch, subjecting thousands of children to systematic torture under the guise of Christian education and moral reform. The evidence collected during the investigation was overwhelming and incontrovertible. The systematic abuse of children at the Greymarch Institute had been conducted on a scale and with a level of organization that defied belief. The torture had been carefully planned and methodically executed, with detailed records maintained to document the procedures and their effects. The fire of November 15, 1923, had been intended to conceal evidence of the abuse, but had instead exposed the full extent of the horror that had been hidden within the institution's walls. The uncovering of the truth about the Greymarch Institute revealed not only the systematic torture of children, but also the complicity of a broader network of individuals and institutions that had enabled the abuse too. The failure of authorities to investigate earlier reports, the silence of parents who feared social embarrassment, and the active participation of faculty and staff had created an environment in which the most heinous crimes could be committed with impunity. The horror uncovered at the Institute would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives and raise profound questions about the nature of institutional authority and the vulnerability of children in American society. Legacy and silence. The legal proceedings that followed the discovery of the systematic abuse at the Greymarch Institute began with great fanfare and public outrage, but quickly devolved into a carefully orchestrated campaign of obfuscation and cover-up. District Attorney George Mitchell, who had initially promised a thorough investigation and prosecution of all those responsible, found himself facing intense pressure from powerful interests who had significant investments in suppressing the truth about the institution's activities. The first indication of the impending cover-up came in January 1924, when key pieces of evidence mysteriously disappeared from the Sheriff's Department evidence locker. The photographs and detailed records from Theodore Greymarch's private files, which had provided the most damning evidence of the systematic abuse, were reported stolen during a break-in that left other valuable evidence untouched. The theft was attributed to unknown vandals, but investigators noted that the perpetrators had demonstrated an unusually sophisticated knowledge of the evidence storage system. By March 1924, the investigation had been effectively neutered through a combination of legal maneuvering and political pressure. Theodore Greymarch, who had been arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder and child abuse, was released on bail posted by an anonymous benefactor. Within weeks of his release, Greymarch had disappeared, reportedly fleeing to South America with the assistance of individuals who were never identified. The warrant for his arrest was quietly withdrawn after prosecutors claimed that insufficient evidence existed to support the charges. The fate of the surviving witnesses provides a disturbing illustration of the lengths to which powerful interests would go to suppress the truth about the Greymarch Institute. James Franklin, the groundskeeper whose testimony had provided the first detailed account of the abuse, was found dead in his home in April 1924, apparently the victim of a gas leak that investigators determined was accidental. Franklin's affidavit and supporting documentation were destroyed in a fire that consumed his residence the same night, eliminating one of the most important sources of evidence against the institution. Mary Sullivan, the kitchen worker who had corroborated Franklin's testimony, suffered a similar fate. In June 1924, Sullivan was committed to the Arkansas State Hospital for the Insane after exhibiting what family members described as symptoms of severe mental illness. Hospital records indicate that Sullivan repeatedly claimed that she was being poisoned by agents of the Greymarch family, allegations that were dismissed as paranoid delusions. Sullivan died in the hospital in September 1924, with the cause of death listed as complications from her mental illness. The 3 child survivors of the November 1923 fire faced a coordinated campaign of intimidation and harassment designed to silence their testimony. Margaret Wells, the 8-year-old who had escaped through a basement window, was removed from her family's custody by state authorities, who claimed that her parents were unfit guardians. Wells was placed in a series of foster homes and institutions, where she was subjected to additional abuse and psychological manipulation. She disappeared from state custody in 1926 and was never located despite extensive searches. Ruth Palmer, the 10-year-old who had escaped through an unboarded window, was committed to a private psychiatric facility in Missouri after her parents were convinced that her testimony about the abuse was evidence of serious mental illness. Palmer remained institutionalized for over 30 years, receiving treatments that included electroshock therapy and experimental psychosurgery. She was finally released in 1955, but her memories of the events at the Greymarch Institute had been effectively erased through decades of psychiatric intervention. Elizabeth Dixon, the 12-year-old who had hidden in a storage closet and witnessed the systematic torture of her fellow students, proved more difficult to silence. Dixon's parents, who were prominent members of Little Rock society, initially supported their daughter's testimony and demanded justice for the victims of the abuse. However, by the end of 1924, the family had abruptly changed their position, claiming that Dixon's account of the events was the product of trauma-induced hallucinations. Dixon herself was sent to a private boarding school in Switzerland, where she remained for over a decade. When she returned to the United States in 1936, she refused to discuss her experiences at the Greymarch Institute and lived as a recluse until her death in 1987. Her personal papers, discovered after her death, contained a detailed manuscript describing the abuse she had witnessed, but the document was destroyed by family members who claimed it was too disturbing to preserve. The physical evidence of the abuse was systematically eliminated through a campaign that began immediately after the fire. The basement room where the torture had been conducted was sealed with concrete and officially designated as structurally unsafe. The heated metal implements used in the abuse were reported as destroyed in the fire, though survivors' testimony indicated that many had been removed from the scene before investigators arrived. The Greymarch Institute itself was demolished in the summer of 1924, with the site sold to a development company that constructed a shopping center on the property. The demolition was conducted with unusual speed and thoroughness, with workers reportedly instructed to remove all traces of the original buildings. The bell tower, which had been the institution's most recognizable feature, was dynamited despite protests from historical preservation groups. The official records of the investigation were sealed by court order in 1925, with access restricted for a period of 75 years. The sealing order was obtained through legal proceedings that were conducted in closed sessions, with no public notice or opportunity for objection. The records were classified as a threat to public safety and morality, with officials claiming that their release would cause unnecessary trauma to the families of the victims. The families of the 17 children who died in the fire were provided with financial settlements that were contingent upon their agreement to remain silent about the circumstances of their children's deaths. The settlements, which ranged from $5,000 to $20,000, were substantial sums for the time period, but were accompanied by strict confidentiality agreements that prohibited any discussion of the abuse or the investigation. Families who violated these agreements faced legal action that could result in the forfeiture of their settlements and additional financial penalties. The broader network of institutions that had been established, according to the principles developed at the Greymarch Institute, continued to operate with minimal oversight or scrutiny. The discovery of the abuse in Arkansas led to brief investigations at several similar facilities, but these inquiries were quickly abandoned when they encountered the same pattern of political pressure and legal obstruction that had characterized the Greymarch. Case: Dr. Edward Collins, the forensic pathologist who had documented the evidence of systematic torture, found his career effectively destroyed by his involvement in the investigation. Collins was dismissed from his position at the University of Arkansas Medical School in 1925, with officials claiming that his research methods were unethical and his findings unreliable. He was unable to find employment at other medical institutions and eventually left the country, spending the remainder of his career in obscurity in Canada. The fire marshal who had conducted the initial investigation, Charles Baker, was transferred to a rural county position in 1925 and was prohibited from discussing his findings about the Greymarch Institute. Baker's detailed report on the fire scene was classified as confidential and was reportedly destroyed in a departmental reorganization in 1932. Baker himself died in 1943, taking his knowledge of the evidence to his grave. The political careers of several officials who had been involved in the investigation were advanced through their cooperation with the cover-up. Sheriff Robert Anderson, who had initially dismissed reports of abuse at the Institute, was elected to the Arkansas State Legislature in 1926 and served for over 2 decades. District Attorney George Mitchell, who had overseen the abandonment of the prosecution, was appointed to the state Supreme Court in 1930 and served with distinction until his retirement in 1955. The Greymarch family itself escaped accountability through a combination of legal maneuvering and financial influence. Augustus Greymarch, who had founded the institution and had been aware of the abuse conducted by his son, was never charged with any crimes related to the systematic torture of children. He retired from public life in 1925 and died peacefully in 1932, his reputation largely intact despite the revelations about his institution. The legacy of the Greymarch Institute extended far beyond the immediate victims of the abuse. The systematic torture of children had been conducted as an experiment in psychological manipulation and social control, with the results used to develop techniques that would be employed in other institutions throughout the United States. The methods pioneered at the Institute influenced the development of programs in psychiatric hospitals, juvenile detention facilities, and reform schools across the country. The silence that surrounded the Greymarch Institute case became a template for the suppression of similar scandals in other institutions. The combination of legal obstruction, political pressure, and financial inducement proved highly effective in preventing public accountability for systematic abuse. The techniques developed to silence witnesses and destroy evidence were refined and employed in numerous other cases throughout the 20th century. The true extent of the abuse at the Greymarch Institute may never be known, as the systematic destruction of evidence and elimination of witnesses has left enormous gaps in the historical record. The sealed court records, if they still exist, remain classified and inaccessible to researchers and the public. The site of the institution itself has been developed and redeveloped multiple times, with no marker or memorial to acknowledge the children who died there. The story of the Greymarch Institute serves as a stark reminder of the vulnerability of children in institutional settings and the ease with which systematic abuse can be concealed and covered up. The failure of authorities to investigate early reports of abuse, the willingness of parents to sacrifice their children's welfare for social status, and the complicity of an entire community in maintaining silence about known crimes created an environment in which the most heinous offenses could be committed with impunity. The legacy of the Greymarch Institute lives on in the damaged lives of the few survivors who escaped its horrors and in the broader pattern of institutional abuse that continues to plague American society. The techniques of psychological manipulation and social control developed at the Institute have been refined and employed in numerous other settings, while the methods used to suppress evidence and silence witnesses have become standard. Practices in the cover-up of institutional scandals. The children who died at the Greymarch Institute have been forgotten by history, their names erased from official records, and their stories buried beneath decades of official silence. The truth about their suffering and death remains hidden, protected by legal barriers and political influence that have proven more durable than the institution itself. The dark fire that consumed their lives continues to burn in the shadows of American society, a reminder of the evil that can flourish when power is exercised without accountability, and children are treated as expendable resources in the pursuit of ideological and financial objectives. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from this way. We can see how far these stories are reaching, and subscribe to the channel. There are many other